free to interrupt me. I'm gonna start recording and get set up, but let me know if you have any questions. So I'm on my Replit page. I'm gonna go to my web app that I'm working on. This is the interface is already set up the way I had it before, so that's kind of nice. And so we're gonna kind of take off from where we left off last time. I'll put a link to this into the voice channel chat if you want to fork that or follow along. And so let's review just quickly what we've created so far, and then we'll look at what we're going to add next. So uh, let's open this in a new tab. So we've created the beginning of this sort of interactive story that we're working on. We have a pretty simple HTML page. We just have like a message where we display a new message. We have some inputs for the user. One is to input their name, one is to select a character type, and then a button to submit. And once we start, so if I put in my name and submit my character type, now we get into this section of the story where um, we change the message up here, but then we add in some options. So we have different options that are represented as buttons. On Wednesday, we'll look at how to do things other than buttons, like images here, or other types of HTML. But for now, we're just going to stick with this. And then for my buttons, what we're going to do today is make these buttons actually do something. So if I click on the button, we can see that our code knows which button is which, but it doesn't actually do anything else. And that's what we're going to work on today, is create sort of a branching story structure. And so we are working on kind of this like interactive story thing, but this could be used for lots of different types of applications. Pretty much any web application is going to have an interface that the user has to use, and then some type of data that we want to display to the user in different circumstances. So the job of the application is to take input from the user and figure out what they're looking for, and then find that data and send it back to them. So I'm gonna map out real quick. Let's get a drawing pad. Let's see. Um, let's use this one. Oh, they saved my drawing from last time. Let's delete this. Okay. Um, so we're gonna have some data. So we have like, yeah. Uh-huh. Oh, yes. Okay. A random button. We could do that. I haven't thought about that, but we could add something similar to that. It kind of depends on how you want what you want that to mean, but we can think of a way to do that. But let's get our buttons to work first, and then we'll make them do different things. So we have some data. So we have some different scenes. Let me see if I can. So we have some scenes. I'm using my mouse, so this is going to look kind of bad. Okay, so we have scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, scene 4. And each one of these scenes has its own sort of set of data. It has like a text that it shows to the user, and then it has a list of options. So it has like option 1, option 2. Okay, so that's a list. And what we want is for our options, when we click on them, they're going to take us to different places. Okay, so option 1 will take us to this scene, option 2 will take us to this scene. And so there's different ways to structure this data. Um, one, there's a lot of different ways to structure this data, but the way that we're going to use is considered to be like kind of the most flexible type of data structure, where we're not going to have any like nested scenes. So we're not going to have like one main scene and then like the options are kind of inside that scene. We're just going to have a big list of scenes that point to each other. So this scene is going to point here, and here. And this scene, could point to here as well, or it could point back to here, or it could point to a whole other scene down here. And this is going to give us the most flexibility because we could have, a relatively linear plot line where we have like these two scenes and then two more scenes down here. And so, scene one either goes to 1A or 1B, and then this goes down here, and this goes down here. And we could have a relatively linear plot line, but then at some point we might want to, have different possibilities. Like we could go back to here, or we could go, somewhere else in the sort of line of scenes. So we're going to structure all of our data as this kind of big list of scenes, and we're going to structure it like a dictionary or an object. So we've talked a little bit about dictionaries and objects. So we're going to use a dictionary. Whoops. I should just use the text tool, but whatever, /object. And the way that that works in JavaScript is we have keys over here to refer to our scenes. So we have keys, and then we have data, which is, the text and the list of options. And the options are actually keys to other scenes. So that's kind of the tricky part, is these keys that refer to our scenes are going to be the same thing as our options. So that way each one of our scenes can point to our other scenes. So this probably sounds a little confusing, but hopefully it'll make sense as we start to build it out. So once we get past our onboarding, so in our first bit of our program, we're really just collecting the user information, which happens here in this onSubmit function. So if we are looking for the username, we'll get the username. If we have the username but not the user type, we'll get the user type. And once we've got both of those things, and you can add more if you want to, but once we have both of those things, we're going to set up our scene, we're going to start our story. So when we start the story, let's skip the data for now. First, we need to get our message and our options from our scene. So we use object destructuring to get the message and the options out of the scene. Although now I'm noticing that this message and this message is the same thing, which is kind of stupid of me. I don't know how this is working. Let's change this to text so that we don't have the same name for this variable. Okay, that was kind of dumb of me, but whatever. So message.text content gets the text for this scene. And then for our options, we have our nice little for loop. So for each option, we have some text, and we create a button with that text in it, and we add the button to our page. We can get rid of this log here. And then each button gets its own event listener. And this is the cool part, is what we're going to add in here is that we're going to figure out where to go next based on these buttons. So that's the next bit we're going to add. There's a few things that we have to do to make this work, but we'll get closer to having a actually working web app. So the first thing that we need to do is we're going to have to like clear this data every time, and we don't want to have to clear all of our buttons. So the easy way that we can do this is make a little container for them. So instead of adding the buttons just to the document itself, we'll make a container for the buttons, and then we can get rid of that container a little bit later and reset it. So that'll make our application a little bit more flexible. So we need to make that global because every time we make a scene, we're going to have to empty this little container. So let's make a container for our scene. And we can put this in the HTML actually because we don't need to create this. So let's go back to our HTML for a second. And we don't have a lot going on here. We just have our message. We have our text input. We have our character type. And then we have our submit button down here. I'm actually going to put this container up next to the message because this is where most of the scene is going to go. And I'll put a little comment here in HTML that says onboarding. So we'll know where our onboarding section is versus our main section. Okay, so I'm going to make a div. ID is scene container. And to start, there's not going to be anything in there. So now I can put my buttons in there, and I can also remove them very easily by using this scene container. So for now, it doesn't change what we see in our preview at all because there's no content in here. If I put like, buttons in here, then we would see that content. But for now, during the onboarding phase, we don't need any content in there. We're going to put it in a little bit later. So I just need to set this up as a container for where I want my scene to go. So if I go back to JavaScript, right now I'm just adding the buttons onto the document directly, but I can do the same thing using a scene container using a reference. So I'm going to get another reference to the scene container. I'm going to say constant scene container equals document.get element by ID, and then put in scene container here. So we talked about how this works a couple demos ago, but basically the document.getElementById by ID is just going to look inside my HTML for this ID, and we just added that. It's this div right here, so it's going to find this div, and it's just going to be a reference to that div, so I can add stuff to it later. So I'm going to grab this scene container variable and just replace document.body down here. And then what I'm going to be able to do is when we add a new scene, what I'm going to do before I say anything else, I'm going to say scene container dot inner HTML, and I'm just going to set it to nothing. So if I set this to empty string, this empties the previous scene. So we didn't need to do this before because we only had one scene, but now we're going to have multiple scenes. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to empty the content from our previous scene and then set up our new scene. So let's run this again. And I'm going to submit and choose designer. Okay, so it's still working, but now look at the difference here. Actually, I should do this over here because it'll be easier to see. Now the difference here is we know where this content is. The buttons aren't down here at the bottom anymore. The buttons that I created are inside of this scene container. So they're right there next to each other. And when I refresh the scene, they're going to disappear. So it's just going to empty those buttons. And so let's see that happen. What I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to call setup scene again. And it's just going to set up the same scene because I haven't added any other content. But what you'll see happen is that we won't have lots of buttons. So I'm going to run it real quick the right way. So we just add my name and submit. So we have our buttons. And each time I click the button, it's actually refreshing the scene. We don't see that happen because they look the same. But if we do it over here with our elements tab, we should actually see the elements change. So if I go put my name in and then type designer, okay, see there's my buttons. If I click on the button, notice that those things are highlighting. So even though the content is the same, it's actually adding those in again. And if I didn't do that, if I took out this empties the previous scene, now you'll see what happened is it's just going to keep adding more and more buttons. So every time I click one of these buttons, it's adding more content to the page. And we don't want to do that because obviously we just want to see the part of the story that we're at. So the easy way to do this, and again, applies to any type of web application, whether it's an interactive story or Twitter or Facebook or any other type of app, that's very easy to get rid of the content within some HTML. I just take that inner HTML and just set it to nothing. And so this empty string will reset this HTML. So that's an easy way to do it. Okay, so now we're ready to actually tell our scene which scene we want to set up. So this is where things start to get tricky. So last time I just had this one scene with this text and then options for where to go. But now I'm going to have multiple scenes. And so my scenes need names. So the name I'm going to give this scene is just intro. Okay, and the way that I'm going to reference this scene, I'm going to make a new object. I'm going to call this scenes. This is all of my scenes. And I can say scenes.intro equals scene. Okay, so now what I want to do now is get the intro from this scene. So the way that I'm going to do that is, let's see, when I finish my onboarding, instead of just set up scene, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say exactly which scene I want. So I'm going to put an argument here called intro. So intro will connect to which one of my scenes I want. Okay, so now I'm getting this argument from setup scene. So it's not just setting up any scene, it's setting up a specific scene. And I have to give that scene a name. So in here, I'm going to put scene name as the argument. I could call this whatever I want. It doesn't really matter. I just need to know what value came from here. So when we call setup scene, now we have to say exactly what scene we want. Okay, so here's my scene name. So now, instead of just scene here, what I'm looking for is scenes, my dictionary of scenes, and the scene name that I want to get. So this is a little confusing because we're sending this data around. So let's look at how this works. So basically what I'm saying here is scenes at intro, right? This is going to work to get my main scene. So there's my main scene there, my intro scene rather. But instead of hard coding this directly in, I'm getting it from the argument where I call setup scene. Okay, so now I'm going to say scene name, and this is going to work the same way. Okay, so there's my name, and I submit, and there we get our scene. Okay, so this is one way to do it, but I can also just put this data directly into my scenes data, and that's going to be how we're going to kind of add it as we add more stuff. So what I'm going to do is inside my scenes data, I'm going to create a key intro, and I'm going to put some data here. So that data is an object. Okay, so let's put a comment here that says key and value or data. And for our intro, the key is intro, and the data is all of this stuff in here. So I'm going to copy that and paste it in here. And then let's click the format button. And so there we go. Now we have our scene intro. Okay, and so we're going to have to add a couple other scenes. So let's delete this extra code. Okay. So now we have our scenes. Scenes at intro is this big scene. And I need a couple more options for each one of my options to go to. So I'm going to copy this and paste twice. And I have to have a comma after each one. So it's going to start to look a little confusing, but basically I just have three scenes now. I have a key, 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 data, data, data. So my first scene is the intro. My second scene is function forest. So I'm just going to call this forest. And my third scene is conditional cove. So I'm going to call this cove. And so now I have to tell my options where they should go. So for each one of my options, I have the text that I show to the user, but then I also have to say where to go after when they click. So I can add that as another field inside of my options. So this is also kind of confusing because my options is a list. And inside my list, I have objects. And inside those objects, I have more key value pairs. So you can start to see how creating data for JavaScript or really any program gets kind of complicated because we have all these things inside of each other. So let's put some line breaks here so it's a little bit easier to read. So we have our options, and each option is separated by a comma. And inside of our options, we have some text, and then we have the place where we want to go next. So the forest, let's call this scene, or let's call this next scene, or let's just call this next. That's nice because it's the same size as text and it's clear enough. So the next scene is forest. Okay, so that's how we're going to connect this option to the next scene. So we'll know that this is the forest and we'll go to the forest scene. So then in my second option, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say next is cove. And so now I'll know which scene to click on. So let's make these scenes different so we'll see the difference. And so I'm gonna go to the forest first, and let's just change the text. So in the forest, I'm gonna say you enter the forest, and I'm gonna say uh, there's a mouse, or let's put some more context in here. It's hard to write code and a story at the same time, but let's say there's a mouse under a tree and a spider on a branch. And then we can say option one is look at the mouse. And of course, that'll take us to a mouse scene, which we're not going to program today, but we can imagine that existing. And the second option is look at the spider. And I'm just kind of writing some random stuff here. Feel free to, make your content talk about whatever you want to talk about. So that's our forest scene. So we have a text for the message, and then we have our two options. And I'm not going to add new scenes yet, so I'm just going to stick with this for now. And so then my cove, I'm going to say, welcome to the cove. There is what happens in a cove? A cove is kind of like in some water. So let's say there's a jellyfish uh, on the beach, or I guess there's a jellyfish behind the rock, and let's say there's a skeleton. This is going to be kind of like a scary story. There's a skeleton uh, in the water. There's some water somewhere. Okay, so then our text for our next options will be look at the jellyfish and look at the skeleton. Okay, so now we have three scenes, and we have one scene that connects to our other scenes, and we're going to add the other connections in a second. I'm going to put a comma here just to make this look consistent. So now we have to actually get our data. So when we go down here to our options, remember we're looping over each option, and then we're getting the text out of the option using destructuring. And now we also have this thing called next, which tells us which scene to go to next. So I'm going to put a comma next to text and say next. That gets us the text value and the next value from each option. And so now when we call setup scene, what we're going to put in here as the argument is next. So next will be either uh, forest or cove, depending on what button we push. And so this way, we can go to either scene. And this is really pretty much everything we need for this interactive story to work. So I'm going to put in my name again. And so now if I go to the forest, now see the text changes to the correct place. You enter the forest, there's a mouse under a tree and a spider on the branch. And these won't do anything. Oh, it is clearing the stuff because it's setting up the scene, but it doesn't have a thing here. Yeah, we'll fix that in a second. But if I run this again and I go to the other direction, so I'll go to the cove, there's a jellyfish and a skeleton, and if I click this, the same thing will happen. But you can see now we're starting to add to the story. So I'm just going to fix a couple things, and then I'm almost done with this section. We don't want it to just like immediately break. So let's give our new scenes a place to go. And then I think actually that will be it. Okay, so for forest, let's just make some endpoints. So I'm not gonna write out full new scenes because that's gonna take a while. But I'll just make some endpoints. So I'll say next for this one is obviously gonna be mouse. And for this one, the next scene, whoops. The next scene for this one, I'll call spider. And these keys, they really don't matter. They just have to match your data. So the user never sees this. I put this, oh, that's the wrong. quotation mark. The user never sees this content, they only see the text content. So it doesn't really matter what you call this as long as you know where it's supposed to go. So we're going to add a mouse and a spider for our forest scene, and then our cove, we will add in a jellyfish. The only rule is you can't have two uh, things with the same, two keys that are exactly the same in the same object. So obviously, like these keys are the same, but they're in different objects. I just can't have scenes with different names. Anyway, so next after this one is skeleton. And so I'm not going to fill these scenes out. I'm not going to add options, but I'll just make the scenes exist so that it goes somewhere. So for my, I have a lot of these. So mouse, yeah, making a story, you end up with a lot of stuff. I'm just going to say the mouse is scary. Uh, and that'll be it for now. And since there's no options, there'll probably be an error, but we'll see. It may just not do anything. So it may just be like the end of the story. And maybe we need like a go back button, although we should program that in. So actually let's program in a go back button. Okay, so mouse spider, that's a scene. I'm just gonna build these first. Yeah, actually let's just, maybe I can do these more efficiently. So we have a mouse, we have a spider, we have a skeleton, that's a scene, and we have a jellyfish. And so for each one of these, I'm just going to add the same options just to go back to the beginning. So this will be like the endpoint. But you can obviously add as many branches as you want to. So let's see if I can edit. Oh, no, it won't let me do that. In some editors, you can edit multiple things at once. Okay, it won't let me do that. So I'm just going to type this and then paste it in. So we have text is, I'm just going to say the blank is scary, you run away. And then the options, I'm just going to go back to the intro. Or we could have an ending scene. Let's just go back to the intro. So for options, it has to be a list, and we only have one option, which is an object. So for the object, let's say text is go back to beginning, and next is intro. So we're going to go back to the intro. So it's nice to be able to go back to the beginning. So this is my data. This way I don't have to do it a bunch of times. Okay, so let's paste it here, paste it here, paste it here, paste it there, and then I'm going to format. It's going to break because I have this dumb code here. So let's delete that and then try to format again. Okay. Okay. So my mouse, let's just put mouse. The mouse is scary, you run away. Options, go back to the beginning, intro. Okay. Same thing here. Spider is scary, you run away. Skeleton is scary, you run away. So see how I've already got like so many scenes? Writing a story like this takes a lot of work because you have to have all these different options. So let's see if it works. So I'll put in my name and submit. Okay, I'm gonna go to the forest. I'm gonna look at the mouse. Mouse is scary, you run away. And I go back to beginning. So now I'll go to the cove, I'll look at the skeleton, go back to beginning. Try the jellyfish. So, there's not a lot of exciting stuff going on in the story, but we can see how we can link all these scenes to different scenes. We can start to branch in different directions, but then we can always go back to any scene that we want to. So maybe the jellyfish connects to the mouse or whatever. And so yeah, our data, all of these scenes will always look the same. They'll just have text for that we display here, and then they'll have options for what we can do next. In the options, we're always going to have text for each button, and then where we're going to go next. And we don't have to have multiple options. So in all of these sort of like endpoint scenes, the only option is to go back to the beginning. But in the branching scenes, there's multiple options. So that's kind of how a story works, and we can make it more complex if we want to as we add more scenes. But this code can basically just stay the same after this. We are going to add some other options instead of just buttons, and that's where things will have to get a little bit more complicated in here. But for now, really, this is everything that we need to do. Now creating the rest of the story is just a matter of updating the scene data, adding as many scenes as you want, changing the text, and changing the options for where the text goes. Okay, so I'm going to wrap this up. I think this is good. I'm trying to think if there's anything else we need to cover. No, I think we're good. We're just going to add some CSS and some other stuff on Wednesday, but I think this is good for where we are now. So I'm just going to save this. I'm going to stop recording. There's a link in the voice channel, so you can get the most recent version here. Yeah.